Hello family, welcome to Stories by Tocci. We bring you interesting folk tales. Please subscribe and drop a like for us. This generosity would go a long way for us. Also share to family and friends. And please turn on post notification to stay tuned for more. Thank you as you do so. Now let's get into the story. The day Madame Eloise arrived in Abaddon, the air felt like a drumskin pulled too tight, ready to thrum at the slightest touch, and Clara knew, in the small quiet of her heart, that their house would begin to walk on eggshells. The taxi turned into their narrow street off Ring Road with a cough and a rattle, sunlight sliding over the roof like hot oil in a pan, and the mango trees leaned as if listening for news. Daniel stepped forward with a smile that didn't quite hold, the corners tethered by duty, his carpenter's hands hovering between welcome and worry. Eloise came down with her 2 boxes and a handbag that clicked with each swing, her perfume old-fashioned and insistent, the kind that lingers in curtains and corners. "I didn't want to trouble you," she said, while already troubling the air with her presence, and when she crossed the threshold, it felt as if she had measured the doorway with her eyes and declared it an old friend. Clara reached out, embraced her with a warmth that didn't beg, then took one box while Daniel grabbed the other, and in that small transfer of weight the balance of the home shifted, almost imperceptibly, like a picture frame tilting 1 degree off center. The living room, dressed in a woven throw from Joss and a framed photo from Calabar, tried to keep its spine straight as Eloise's gaze patrolled the shelves, the rug, the lamp, the way a school inspector taps a desk with a pencil. "Ah, this your flower is thirsty," Eloise murmured, touching a fern as if it had asked for water in a language only she spoke, and she laughed at nothing in particular, the sound bleached and brittle. The neighbor's radio dripped highlife from the window. A hawker sang Gary as if auctioning memories. The hour settled like dust on polished wood, and the house prepared to learn a new dictionary of footsteps. They had married in Enugu 7 months before, under a sky that wore the color of a well-loved wrapper, and even then Eloise's smiles had been careful, as though kindness were a precious spice that should be pinched, not poured. Clara had learned to take that pinch and stretch it into a meal, fold it into small jokes, sew it into thank yous, let it bake under patience the way bread becomes more itself with time. Daniel, whose workshop in Dugby smelled of sawdust and quiet ambition, had a habit of smoothing rough edges even when no splinter showed. He told Clara, on the way back from Mapo Hall where they took their wedding photos, that his mother was set in her ways. And Clara nodded, because water doesn't argue with stone, it simply learns the corners and keeps moving. But the letter that came last week carried a different wind. "I'm unwell. I will stay a few weeks. Mother." The handwriting was neat, the kind that keeps secrets between the lines, and Daniel's jaw had tightened while he read, a flicker of boyhood obedience peeking through the window of his grown-up face. Now, as Eloise opened drawers with the innocent curiosity of someone who already knows where everything should be, Clara held on to gentleness like a handle on a moving bus. "Mama, sit please," she said, setting down water in a glass that wore a tiny chip like a memory of other days, and Eloise sat, but only to better command the room with her eyes. "You mustn't stress yourself," she announced, which sounded like care but felt like a verdict, and then she asked Daniel to bring down her second box because your father's blanket is inside, and there, tucked into that sentence like a folded knife, was the weight of history no one had invited in. The fan hummed overhead, keeping time while silence stretched like a lazy cat. Clara smiled at it, that old silence, and refused to let it climb onto her lap. Night lowered itself gently over Jericho and Bodija, and every back street that knew how to keep a secret, and the house breathed in a different rhythm, as if someone had moved the metronome without warning. Daniel came to bed with the smell of kerosene on his shirt cuff, his hands still carrying invisible sawdust, his mouth carrying a sigh he tried to bury in Clara's hair. "Let's be patient," he said, words arranged like chairs at a wake, useful, dignified, not exactly comforting. Clara traced a circle on his wrist with her finger, a small compass she hoped would still point north in the morning. "I will be," she said, because patience had lived in her chest since she was a girl in McCourty watching the river negotiate its own temper, but inside she folded a private promise and hid it behind her ribs. This home would not forget its original heartbeat. From the guest room came the rustle of wrappers, the thud of a box being opened, the soft cluck of a tongue appraising shelves that had done nothing wrong. Somewhere outside, a generator coughed itself to sleep. A bike sped past, its horn a quick prayer. Clara thought of the day she first arranged the spice rack. Cloves like buttons, cumin like steady soil, dried pepper red enough to suggest mischief, and she felt the kitchen as if it were a small animal she had tamed with warm hands. She remembered Enugu's red earth clinging to her wedding shoes, remembered how Eloise's blessing had arrived late and ambled through their reception as if needing to be begged, remembered Daniel's nervous laugh as he introduced mother to wife, bridge to river. In the dark, Clara counted her breaths, stitched a little courage to each inhale, and let the night hold them in a bowl of quiet that was not quite peace but was not yet storm. Morning tried to be ordinary. The kettle stuttered into steam, the sun climbed the window like a persistent child, and the street unfurled its market sounds. The bargaining hum near Oyai, the chorus of buses promising places they might or might not deliver. But the ordinary had learned new rules overnight. Eloise stood in the kitchen with her head tied like a crown, and the tea towel draped across her shoulder like a sash, and the stove answered to her, as if it had been waiting for her return from a long, imagined journey. "Salt is not a wish," she told Clara, dipping a spoon into the pot and letting her face confess disapproval. "In Benin City, even children cook with sense." It was the kind of sentence that arrives smiling and leaves a scratch. Clara washed the plates without clatter, because noise is a weapon, and she preferred wit. "Thank you, Mama," she said, the words tidy and ironed, not a wrinkle out of place. She let Eloise rearrange things that didn't require rearranging. Pepper jars shifted like chess pieces, pots nested in unfamiliar combinations, the good ladle exiled to the wrong drawer. She watched, storing everything the way a librarian remembers where a borrowed book will eventually return. When a neighbor from Abeokuta knocked with a bag of garden okra and a weather report wrapped in gossip, Eloise met her at the door and said, "Our new wife is still learning," as if the sentence were a ribbon tied around a gift. The day walked on, polite as a visiting minister, and in the quiet left behind Clara felt the first thread of unease snag on the nail of her patience. She tucked it back, smoothed the cloth of her smile, and told herself the same story she told seedlings in her terracotta pots. Take root slowly, ignore the boots, reach for the light as if it were your birthright. By the second week, Clara began to notice that the air inside the house felt heavier in the mornings, as though each room had been told to wait before breathing. She woke before Daniel, lying still in the thin light filtering through the curtains, listening for the small domestic sounds that had once belonged to her alone. There was the scrape of cupboard doors, the metallic clink of spoons against enamel mugs, the faint rhythm of slippers moving in a deliberate pattern. Madame Eloise had claimed the kitchen not with force, but with a quiet inevitability, the way the tide claims a shore it has always touched. Clara would step into boil water and find the kettle already singing, the tea poured into cups with patterns she usually reserved for special guests, as though the house itself had agreed to follow a new order. Daniel seemed oblivious, his mornings spent gathering tools for his workshop and adjusting planks on the veranda, occasionally stepping in to greet his mother with a warmth that carried a tinge of boyhood gratitude. Clara did not begrudge him that. She had married a man who loved deeply, but she began to see that such love could also be blind in places where it most needed sight. When Eloise spoke, it was rarely in the form of a request. More often, it was a verdict delivered with a gentle smile, the kind that left no room for negotiation. "This pepper is too shy," she would say, adding more without asking, or meat should be cut bold, not timid, while slicing it in thick, uneven portions. The effect was not immediate, but each day Clara's hands found fewer tasks waiting for them, her rhythm disrupted by small interjections that made her feel like a visitor in the space she had shaped. Even the neighbors began to adjust. When Mrs. Iola from the corner house came by with a basket of oranges, she now asked for Mama first, her voice tilting toward the guest room before settling on Clara. It was subtle, the way a shadow lengthens without anyone noticing until the light is almost gone. It was not in Clara's nature to confront storms head-on. She had learned long ago in McCourty, watching her father negotiate disputes between fishermen and farmers over river access, that one could lose the whole harvest by speaking too soon. But silence was a double-edged blade. In this house, it began to carve away at her presence, slicing thin strips off the life she had built with Daniel. Mealtimes became the most difficult hours. She would come to the table to find Daniel's plate already filled and steaming, his cup refilled before he could even lift it halfway. When she tried to serve him herself, Eloise would step in lightly, saying, "Let me, dear, you must rest your hands," in a tone that made rest sound like incapacity. Daniel, perhaps thinking he was sparing her effort, accepted without protest, and in his acceptance, Clara saw how easily a habit could become a wall between two people. Evenings were no better. In the dim living room, where the only light came from the yellow glow of the standing lamp by the sofa, Eloise would speak to Daniel about the old days in their family home in Abeokuta. Stories of when he was small, the coffee had that one rainy season, the time she sold her best gold chain to pay his school fees. These were important stories, rich with sacrifice, but they were told in a way that left no space for Clara to add her own. She became the audience in her own home, smiling when expected, nodding when appropriate, and disappearing into the kitchen to wash cups just to feel useful. On some nights, when the conversation turned to the subject of keeping a home, Eloise's voice would grow firmer, as if speaking to the room at large. A wife must know her place, for peace to reign. The words floated without a direct target, yet they landed on Clara's chest with the weight of a personal address. She began to keep a small notebook in her nightstand, not to write complaints, but to remind herself of the little details she didn't want to lose. The way the curtains caught the morning sun, the smell of the pawpaw tree outside their bedroom window, the precise shade of Daniel's smile when he returned from work. These were her anchors in a current that seemed determined to carry her elsewhere. Then came the day the fever arrived, creeping into her body as quietly as Eloise had into her routines. It began with a light shiver that Clara dismissed as the weather playing tricks, then a heaviness in her limbs that made lifting a pot feel like carrying a basin of stones. By afternoon, her skin burned hot enough that the air itself felt like a burden. She lay on the bed, curtains drawn against the brightness, listening to the distant hum of Daniel's hammer in the workshop. When Eloise entered the room, it was with the brisk efficiency of someone accustomed to illness in the family. She touched Clara's forehead, clucked her tongue, and said, "You need to rest. Leave the house to me." It might have been kindness, if not for the glint in her eye that seemed to suggest an opportunity had just presented itself. Clara tried to sit up, to at least offer to make lunch, but Eloise pressed her gently back onto the pillow. No, don't trouble yourself," she said, smoothing the sheet as though tucking her in for the night instead of the afternoon. From then on, the sounds of the kitchen became distant music Clara could not join. She heard pots clanging, the rich aroma of stew drifting in, the occasional scrape of a chair against the tiled floor. Yet when she rose, dizzy but hungry, she found nothing waiting, no plate set aside, no cup of tea left to cool by her bedside. The first day she thought perhaps it was an oversight. The second day, she told herself she had simply woken too late. But on the third day, when her stomach cramped and the smell of fried plantain floated in like a deliberate taunt, she understood that she was not merely being allowed to rest, she was being kept away. Hunger has a way of sharpening the senses, and in her weakness, Clara began to hear more clearly the quiet exchange between Eloise and a visiting neighbor. "She is too fragile," Eloise said, lowering her voice just enough to make the words feel stolen. "This marriage needs a stronger backbone." It was then that Clara's fever broke, not from sweat or medicine, but from a sudden clarity that spread through her veins like a second kind of heat. Daniel, as always, seemed unaware of the undercurrent. In the evenings, he would bring his tired frame to the bedroom, smelling of sawdust and varnish, and ask how she was feeling. Clara would say she was improving, because there was little to gain in telling him otherwise when his face already carried the fatigue of long days. Yet in her mind, the picture was forming. The house was not simply under temporary management. It was being subtly reshaped, its loyalties rewoven thread by thread. Even the way Daniel spoke at dinner had changed. His stories of the day were shorter, his laughter more easily drawn by his mother's remarks than by Clara's. She could not say he loved her less. Love is not so easily measured, but she could see that the weight of Eloise's presence pressed against the balance they had once shared. On the fourth evening of her illness, when the hunger had become a companion she could name, Clara lay awake after Daniel had drifted into sleep. The night outside was loud with crickets, and the occasional bark of a restless dog floated through the window. She stared at the ceiling fan, its blade slicing the air in slow, steady circles, and she thought about the way the river back in McCourty would sometimes change its course without warning, cutting new paths through farmland, swallowing some plots whole, and leaving others rich with silt. In those moments, the farmers had a choice: stand in the water and be swept away, or learn the new path and plan along its edges. As the hours stretched on, Clara realized she was standing in such a river now, and the current would not wait for her permission. Somewhere between the ache in her body and the gnaw in her stomach, she began to map out a quiet plan, not revenge, but a reclamation. And with that thought, she closed her eyes, the shadow of a smile playing at the corner of her lips, as if she had just remembered something Eloise had forgotten: that a home, like a river, belongs to the one who understands its flow. By the time Clara's fever finally loosened its grip, her body felt as though it had been washed ashore by a long, punishing tide. She could stand without the walls leaning toward her, but the weakness in her limbs reminded her that she had spent days running on little more than air and stubborn will. She moved carefully that morning, her bare feet against the cool floor tiles, and found the house humming with the same rhythm it had kept during her illness, Eloise at the center, directing unseen currents. Daniel was already gone, leaving behind the faint trace of his cologne and the steady absence of his boots by the door. The kitchen smelled of roasted yam and groundnut stew, the kind of breakfast Clara would have made for him on a good day, but there was no plate set aside for her, only the clatter of spoons and the hiss of oil under Eloise's watchful hand. Clara took a seat at the dining table, not to eat but to watch, noting the deliberate way her mother-in-law avoided her eyes while moving between the counter and the stove. Hunger sat beside her like an old friend, no longer gnawing but whispering. She had learned its language in those days of forced fasting. It was patient, but it never forgot. The realization that she had been deliberately excluded from the table had cut deeper than the absence of food itself. This was not about meals, it was about place, about the silent agreement in a home regarding who is welcomed into its heart. Clara understood, with the same clarity she had seen in the McCourty riverbanks when water abandoned one path for another, that she would have to reclaim her space not through confrontation, but through a quiet strength her mother-in-law would not see coming until it was too late. Her first move was not to challenge the kitchen's new regime, but to adapt in ways that would not draw attention. At night, after the house had folded itself into sleep and Eloise's breathing in the guest room had settled into a slow tide, Clara would rise. She moved barefoot to avoid betraying her steps, her fingers brushing against walls she knew better than her own pulse, and retrieved small rations she had hidden in unlikely places. A roll of bread tucked into the sewing basket beneath scraps of fabric, a tin of sardines behind a row of mismatched bowls, a packet of groundnuts folded into the lining of her handbag. These were not feasts, but they were enough to keep her strength from dwindling. The act of eating in secret was strangely empowering. Each bite was a small defiance, each swallow a reminder that she was not yet beaten. During the day, she maintained the facade of recovery, moving slowly around the house, keeping her voice low, making herself seem unthreatening. Eloise appeared to take this as proof that her strategy had succeeded, and in that assumption lay the first thread Clara could pull. The more Eloise believed her to be weak, the less guarded she became, and the more freely she spoke on the phone to her cousin in Abeokuta. One afternoon, while arranging laundry on the line, Clara overheard a conversation that shifted the ground beneath her. "I can't go back now," Eloise was saying, her voice carrying just enough for Clara to catch. "Chike wants to sell the land. I need a place where I can stand." The words were a key in a lock. Clara understood then that this was more than a temporary visit. Eloise's roots were searching for new soil, and she had chosen Daniel's house as the place to plant them. This knowledge did not fill Clara with rage. It filled her with a steadiness that came from knowing the shape of the game. Clara's plan unfolded like fabric cut with deliberate hands. No jagged edges, no wasted cloth. She decided she would not push Eloise out by force, but make the house so firmly hers that any attempt to stay would feel like living inside someone else's skin. She began with the smallest acts, the kind that could be mistaken for kindness or coincidence. In the mornings, she greeted Eloise warmly, complimented her head ties, and asked after her friends back in Abeokuta. She made herself useful in ways that seemed supportive, fetching the broom before it was asked for, setting aside herbs from the small garden in the yard. All the while, she was taking back the house in inches. She moved her favorite cooking spoon from the back of the drawer to the front, returned the framed photo from their honeymoon in Calabar to the top of the bookshelf, replaced the soap in the bathroom with the lavender scent she and Daniel both preferred. These were not open declarations, but quiet markers, like flags planted in reclaimed territory. She also began re-establishing her presence with the neighbors, stepping out to buy vegetables from the woman at the roadside stall, greeting familiar faces on her way back. The subtle shift did not go unnoticed. Mrs. Iola, who had been asking for Mama first, began to stop Clara in the street for small conversations, slipping back into the easy warmth they'd once shared. Inside the house, Clara's politeness never wavered, but her eyes had taken on a calm, measuring quality, as if she were always 2 steps ahead of the moment at hand. Eloise, accustomed to Clara's quiet compliance, did not yet realize the ground beneath her was beginning to move. The true turning point came one evening when Daniel returned from work earlier than expected. Clara had anticipated his arrival and prepared a small tray of food from ingredients she had saved from the garden and pantry, vegetable soup rich with uga leaves, pounded yam soft as cloud. She set it on the veranda, lit by the gold of the setting sun, and invited him to sit before Eloise could intercept. Daniel, surprised and clearly pleased, ate slowly, his eyes lingering on her more than the meal. Eloise came out midway through, a plate in her hand for him, only to find it redundant. For the first time in weeks, Daniel seemed to notice the quiet dance of territory between the two women. "I didn't know you cooked today," he said to Clara, as though rediscovering a part of her he had forgotten. Clara smiled, saying only, "I felt strong enough." It was not a challenge, not an accusation, just a statement layered with truth. That night, after Daniel had gone to bed, Clara sat by the window in the living room, watching the street lamps flicker to life. The air outside was warm and still, and she could hear distant laughter from a group of young men on their way home from football. She thought about the river again, the way it carves new paths when the old ones no longer serve. She had no intention of damming Eloise's current with confrontation. She would simply make her own channel so deep and so unshakable that the water would have no choice but to flow elsewhere. The quiet in her chest felt different now, not the quiet of surrender, but the quiet before a harvest. Clara began her quiet work the way a careful tailor threads a needle in low light, testing the strength of the string before the first stitch, measuring cloth with her fingertips, keeping her breath even so the fabric does not tremble. At dawn, when Abaddon still wore its nightshirt and the street yawns were only beginning, Kiki riders stretching their backs, bread sellers lifting trays like little sons, she walked through the rooms and read the house like a page she had once written and then, for a time, been told to forget. She adjusted chairs by inches so the corridor carried her memory again. The living room rug, once angled like a shrug, was squared to the coffee table as if it had finally agreed to listen. In the kitchen, she set labels with a smile and a trick. Salt wore Sugar's hat, and Sugar pretended to be salt, while Cinnamon, that sweet talker, found itself guarding the place of ground pepper. She did not do this to humiliate Eloise. She did it to coax her into stepping on her own toes, to let the house hold up a mirror and ask, without malice, who is truly in charge here. When Eloise brewed tea, the first sip puckered her mouth with harshness. When she salted stew by habit, the spoon returned with a sugary grin. Eloise frowned, changed the labels, and found them swapped again the following week, not aggressively, not rudely, simply as if the house had a sense of humor and preferred Clara's handwriting. At the same time, Clara moved her keepsakes back to their rightful stations. The Calabar shoreline photo reclaimed the mantel. A woven Tiv basket from McCourty held keys by the door, and the little clay bird from Zaria perched on the window ledge, facing the street like a scout. These were breadcrumbs back to herself. When neighbors hailed her in the lane, "Auntie Clara, how body?" she answered with warmth that did not beg approval, trading recipes and jokes, buying tomatoes from the woman whose laughter always ended in a soft hiccup. She folded Daniel into her rhythm again with small, unarguable gestures. A flask of pepper soup to Dugby on a rain-heavy afternoon, a napkin tucked into his toolbox with a note that said, "Simply eat first." The house, which had learned another drummer's beat, began to fall back in step with her without raising its voice. If Eloise noticed the tide turning, she hid it under a fresh head tie and an old proverb, but when she paused in the hallway and looked around with a puzzled blink, Clara understood the question flickering behind her eyes. When did this place stop echoing me? It was not all mischief and rearranged jars. Clara's counter-move was half hospitality, half chess, 13 steps ahead, always offering water first. On a bright afternoon that smelled faintly of diesel and guava, she invited 2 female clients of Daniel's, architects from Bodija who paid on time and spoke like measuring tapes, to visit on Saturday. She told Eloise Friday night, "We may have guests sometime next week," while texting the women, "See you tomorrow by 4. Saturday came dressed in gold. Clara had already set ground rules on paper with a kind of gentle boldness. Order for the house, she called it, not rules. Pinned on the fridge, wrapped in courtesy so thick it felt like velvet. She cleaned without performing, cooked without announcing, and let the clock do the talking. When the architects arrived, Eloise's apron was hanging by the back door. A stew still tasting of wrong salt simmered on low, and the living room wore the stray hairpins of an unfinished morning. But Clara had her safety net ready. Spiced chin-chin she'd fried at dawn, a jug of Zobo chilled beneath ice blocks that clinked like tiny bells, and small meat pies whose edges she had crimped with the patience of a scribe. The women sank into the sofa as if it had been waiting with open arms, and in 10 minutes the house told a story without words, that its heartbeat matched Clara's footsteps. They spoke about new shelving for a Lagos office, about timelines and varnish, about a possible project in Port Harcourt, where Daniel's eye for grain would be worth its weight in gold. Eloise attempted to step in with her familiar gloss of history, reminding all present who had sold jewelry once to pay for school fees, and Clara nodded with gratitude that did not rope her throat, then steered the chat back to delivery dates, invoices, and would finish. After they left, one of the architects squeezed Clara's arm by the gate and said, "You run this place with quiet hands," and the words stayed with her like a cloak that fit. Daniel returned early, saw the box samples on the table and the ledger with tidy notes, and asked questions that placed Clara in the center of the decision. That night, Eloise muttered in the kitchen and added sugar to tea with the suspicion of someone who has been wronged by labels, and Clara, wiping the counter, hummed a tune she hadn't hummed in weeks, the melody slipping into corners like balm. Information is a river, and Clara learned to cup it without spilling. She did not lurk. She simply listened with both ears open and a calm face that did not set off alarms. When Eloise spoke to her cousin Chike on the phone, the hallway carried pieces of sentences like leaves during harmattan. Court date, boundary, survey plan, buyer from Ijibu who wanted quick signatures. It became clear that the land in Abeokuta was not only about memory, it was about a hinge. Sell too fast, and the next door might open onto a corridor with no rooms. Clara did not gloat over the discovery. She filed it in her chest beside the lavender soap and the keys by the door. If a person is building a nest in your rafters, you do not torch the house. You fix the eaves and make the rafters inhospitable to strangers while leaving sky enough for them to fly elsewhere. She deepened her friendships outside their gate, especially with Pa Sewell, whose compound radio was a gossip magnet, and with Kemi the tailor, who heard more truths than a judge in court, because people talk when they stand for fittings. Through them she learned which lawyer in Ibadan handled land matters without swallowing clients, which registrar's office in Oyo closed its shutters earlier than posted, and which days the road to Abeokuta flowed rather than choked. She took this knowledge and stitched it into a plan that did not hurt anyone, but also did not leave her unguarded. On a Wednesday market run, she sent a discreet message to Anin Kem, Eloise's friend who never lied even by mistake, asking for clarity and offering help with paperwork if that would keep panic from driving decisions. Her tone had no thorns. Back home, she placed the house back onto its rails by ritual. Morning prayers without proclamations, a broom laid to rest with the bristles facing inward, herbs gathered and tied in bundles that listened to her hands. She returned music to the rooms in soft threads, a radio tuned to jazz that wandered like a thoughtful goat, not loud enough to provoke, just enough to teach walls to breathe again. Even the windows seemed to blink open more often, curtains catching the breeze like sails. The old order had been like a tight shoe. Now the leather softened, not new but newly forgiving. If Eloise felt the pinch, she said little, but the lines beside her mouth deepened as she checked labels twice and still got the stew wrong once. The house's small mistakes began to betray where loyalty was flowing. The day Clara set her biggest piece in motion, the sky over Ibadan wore a pale blue that made everything beneath it look honest. She had invited 2 of Daniel's long-standing clients, men from Kaduna and Owerri, to drop by for a tasting of wood finishes, and she paired the event with a simple, elegant meal timed like a drumline. Okra soup with smoked fish that remembered riverbanks, jollof that spoke its mind, fried plantain that knew how to blush. She told Daniel that morning, "Let me host today," and received a nod that held trust and maybe a sprinkle of relief. Eloise spent the early afternoon in her room, on the phone again, voice strained, words catching like cloth on a nail. Clara carried on setting a table that spoke in full sentences, clean plates that shone without shouting, water glasses aligned like a row of promises, napkins folded as if they liked their shapes. When the clients arrived, the house opened its mouth and said welcome without needing translation. Clara led them through samples, asked the right questions, and anchored the conversation to contracts that respected Daniel's time. Eloise appeared at the doorway midway, lips curved in a smile that did not climb into her eyes, and watched as Clara poured zobo and laughter in equal measure. There was a moment, small, almost private, in which Daniel looked across the room and saw his wife poised like a bridge that could carry trucks, not just foot traffic. He moved to stand at her side as naturally as a river chooses downhill. After the guests left, with handshakes given and future dates written, Daniel leaned against the counter and said, "You made today easy." His gratitude did not apologize for itself. Eloise, perhaps feeling the floor tilt, reached for an old script. "In our days, wives did not." But the sentence trailed off as she recognized that the room had no ears for that era. Later that night, when the bulbs hummed like insects and the quiet was thick enough to lean on, Clara placed a brown folder on the dining table. Notes from the call with Anin Kem. Options for securing Eloise's portion from the land without sinking anyone. She did not present it as triumph. She offered it like water. If this was a battle, it had never been about bruises. It was about returning the house to its original language while leaving a path for everyone to walk without stepping on each other's shadow. And as sleep came like a soft rain, Clara felt the river in her chest deepen its channel, steady and sure, ready for whatever stones might roll in at dawn. Daniel noticed the envelope before Clara even spoke about it. It had been lying on the edge of the console table, its flap sealed with the faint roughness of an old stamp, the handwriting slanted as though the writer had been in a hurry. Eloise had collected it from the gate in the late afternoon, and carried it to her room with the posture of someone holding both a burden and a lifeline. She did not speak of it at dinner, but her fingers twitched slightly each time she reached for her cup, and her eyes had the faraway focus of a person rehearsing decisions in their head. Clara, who had learned the art of watching without staring, caught the small tremor in Eloise's hand as she folded her wrapper across her knees. That night, while Daniel was locking the workshop and checking the tool shed, Clara sat at the edge of their bed and told him gently, "Mama's visit is not only about helping you remember your roots. She's standing on ground she fears will give way." Daniel's brow tightened, a shadow of boyhood obedience passing over his face before he could stop it. "What do you mean?" he asked, though part of him already knew. She told him about the overheard conversations, about Chaik, about the land in Abeokuta that was about to change hands faster than Eloise could make a plan. Daniel leaned back, the wall behind him suddenly feeling colder. "So all this was to hold on to something?" he murmured. Clara did not say yes in words. Her silence carried the shape of the truth. He asked if she had been angry knowing this all along, and she shook her head. Anger would have wasted the days. "I needed to plant my feet first." For a long moment, they sat without speaking, the ceiling fan slicing the air into steady pieces, both of them understanding that what had been unfolding in their home was not just a contest for space, but a quiet test of endurance where survival was measured in inches. By the next morning, Daniel had decided he could no longer let the situation drift like a canoe without a paddle. He rose earlier than usual, his movements brisk, the air around him carrying a new decisiveness that Clara had not seen in weeks. When Eloise came into the dining room, her hair wrapped high and her chin lifted, Daniel invited her to sit. The breakfast table bore no theatrics, just akra, pap, and a small saucer of honey, but the mood had the weight of something formal. "Mama," he began, his voice pitched between respect and resolve, "we need to agree on how to live together so none of us is lost in the process." Eloise's eyes narrowed slightly, as though measuring the exact size of this unexpected boundary. He spoke of space, of routines, of the need for peace that did not silence anyone, but also did not let one voice drown out the rest. Clara remained quiet, her gaze on the rim of her cup, letting Daniel carry the words. He suggested a clearer division of tasks, a rhythm everyone could follow, and a courtesy that left no room for the kind of sharp remarks that wore at the edges of a day. Eloise listened, her fingers tapping once against the table, and replied with a proverb. "When a chick teaches the hen to scratch, the ground grows confused." Daniel did not flinch. "Then let the ground be wide enough for both," he said, and something in his tone made the air still. Eloise did not agree outright, but she also did not refuse. She took a spoonful of pap, set it down, and changed the subject to the price of beans in the market. Yet in that shift, Clara sensed the first sign of retreat. Not defeat, but an acknowledgement that the terms of the house were no longer hers alone to write. Days that followed carried the kind of tension that does not raise its voice but makes itself known in the quiet. Eloise kept more to her room, emerging for meals and short phone calls, her laughter thinner when it came. Clara noticed that the neighbors once again asked for her first when they stopped by, and the kitchen began to feel like a place that would open its arms to her without asking for a password. Still, she did not move too quickly. Pushing too hard could snap the fragile thread of understanding they had spun. Instead, she kept her reclaiming subtle. A new set of herbs drying above the sink, a table runner in colors she and Daniel had chosen together, a return to the habit of playing music in the evenings, not loudly, but enough to give the rooms a hum that matched her own breathing. Eloise cooked less often now, and when she did, the labels on the jars did not seem to play tricks on her anymore, though Clara suspected that was because she had stopped changing them. One late afternoon, Eloise joined her in shelling groundnuts on the veranda, the act silent except for the soft crack of shells and the thud of nuts falling into the bowl. It was not an apology, but it was a presence without barbs, and Clara accepted it for what it was. That night, she prepared Eloise's favorite akra and custard, and served it without commentary. Eloise ate slowly, eyes on the table, then murmured, "Thank you," as if testing how the words felt in her mouth. In that moment, Clara knew the river between them might never run as it once did, but it had stopped flooding the banks. The true shift came not with words, but with a decision. One Saturday morning, Eloise called Clara into her room and told her she would be returning to Abeokuta before the month's end. She said it without ceremony, as if she were merely describing the weather, but the meaning sat heavy between them. "The house is in good hands," she added, and for the first time in weeks, her eyes met Clara's without challenge. Clara nodded, neither triumphant nor hesitant, simply accepting the moment as the natural bend of the current. Later that day, she found Daniel in his workshop and told him. His shoulders eased, his smile was small but steady, and he kissed her forehead before turning back to the plank he had been sanding. The rest of the weekend passed with an odd lightness, as though the walls themselves had exhaled. When Eloise finally packed her boxes, it was done quietly, no slamming of doors, no clipped goodbyes. At the gate, she paused and said, "You are stronger than I thought," the words uneven but unforced. Clara replied, "Travel well, Mama," her voice carrying no shadow. The taxi pulled away, the street swallowed its sound, and the house settled into a silence that felt earned. That evening, Clara lit a single lamp in the living room, the soft glow touching the photo from Calabar, the Tiv basket by the door, and the kitchen doorway where she had stood so many times before. Daniel joined her, carrying 2 bowls of steaming soup, and together they ate without speaking much, the comfort of the moment filling more space than words could. Outside, Ibadan's night sounds moved as they always had, but inside, the rhythm was theirs again. The morning after Eloise's departure began with a kind of quiet Clara had not felt in months, the sort that does not merely fill the house but seeps into its bones. It was not the silence of suspicion or the muffled air of tension. It was the pause a room takes before remembering it can breathe freely. Light came in through the windows without being filtered by closed curtains, touching the walls with soft gold that made every surface seem like it had been newly washed. Clara rose before Daniel, not out of necessity, but because the day felt like a fresh sheet of paper waiting for her handwriting. In the kitchen, she moved at her own pace, her hands reacquainting themselves with every handle, every jar, every drawer as if they were old friends she was meeting after a long journey apart. The kettle whistled for her, not for someone else's morning, and she poured the water into the same blue mug she had chosen when she and Daniel first moved in. Outside, the voices of street vendors drifted lazily, someone calling for bread, another for sugarcane, and the faint clatter of a distant grinding machine served as a reminder that the city's life kept turning regardless of the private storms within its walls. Daniel joined her not long after, his hair still rumpled, his eyes soft in a way they hadn't been lately. They shared breakfast at the table without interruption, the conversation flowing with the ease of water finding its path again. Clara told him about small changes she wanted to make, new curtains for the living room, repainting the front door, planting herbs in the yard, and he listened, nodding as though each idea was a pebble placed into the foundation of something stronger than before. When they finished, Daniel cleared the plates without being asked, a simple gesture, but one that made Clara's chest feel quietly full. In the days that followed, the house began to reveal itself again, almost like a garden left untended for too long, but still capable of blooming once the weeds were gone. Clara's touch returned to every room, not with urgency, but with the patience of someone building something meant to last. She spent one afternoon airing out the guest room, letting the sunlight pour across the bedspread and into the corners where shadows had lingered. She polished the wooden shelves until they caught the light like calm water, dusting away the last traces of a presence that had been both guest and storm. In the living room, she shifted the furniture into a layout that encouraged laughter, with chairs facing each other instead of the television, and placed fresh flowers from Bodija Market on the low table. Daniel noticed these changes in quiet moments, coming in from work to find the air scented with cloves from her cooking, or walking past the bedroom to hear her humming as she folded laundry. And each time, his expression softened, the edges of his day smoothing out. Clara herself felt the difference most in the kitchen, where she no longer had to account for someone else's rhythm or the possibility of finding her ingredients moved. Her own system returned, efficient and warm, the spice rack once again her map. The neighbors seemed to sense the shift too. Mrs. Iola began visiting more often, dropping off fresh vegetables and sitting for tea without glancing toward the guest room first. Children passing on the street called her name with the old familiarity, their laughter spilling in through the open gate. Even the evenings took on a different tone. Radio music from the veranda, Daniel's quiet conversations about work, and a shared meal that tasted of peace. It was not that the memory of the months before had vanished, but it no longer pressed against her as it once had. It sat in the background, a shadow that had lost its sharpness. One afternoon, as the sun dipped low and painted the street in amber light, a knock came at the gate. Clara opened it to find Aning Kem standing there, a warm smile on her face and a small basket in her hands. Inside were dried fish, garden eggs, and a bundle of fresh scent leaves. "For your soup," she said simply, stepping inside as though she had been meaning to visit for weeks. They sat together on the veranda, and over the course of their conversation, Nkem told her that the land in Abeokuta had been secured for Eloise, the documents signed and settled without dispute. "She will be fine," Nkem assured, her tone steady, "and she knows this house is yours now." Clara listened, a weight she had not even realized she was carrying beginning to lift. She had not wished Eloise harm, only clarity, and now it seemed that both of them had found ground they could stand on without pushing the other off. When Kem left, Daniel returned from work to find Clara in the kitchen preparing a pot of soup with the ingredients from the basket. They ate it that night with fufu, the flavors deep and rich, as though the meal itself understood the journey they had taken to arrive at this table together. Daniel, between mouthfuls, told her how proud he was of the way she had handled everything. She met his gaze without needing to explain the choices she had made. The outcome spoke for itself. The evening before market day, Clara stood at the window of their bedroom, looking out over the street lit by the warm glow of scattered bulbs. The city beyond was restless with life, motorcycles humming past, distant music from a bar, the occasional call of someone greeting a neighbor. But inside, the house felt like a calm tide. Daniel was in the living room, reading through a new set of orders from his clients in Port Harcourt, occasionally calling out a question about delivery schedules. Clara answered without moving from her spot, her voice carrying easily through the open door. She thought of the months before, of the quiet battles fought in small actions, of the nights she had eaten bread in secret, and the mornings she had hidden strength under a veil of weakness. She thought, too, of Eloise's last words at the gate, and how they had not been a concession so much as a recognition. Strength, Clara realized, was not always loud. Sometimes it was the decision to keep a door open while still keeping your place inside. As she closed the curtains, she felt certain that whatever came next, be it guests, challenges, or unexpected changes, she and Daniel would face it with the kind of balance they had fought to restore. She joined him on the sofa, leaning into his side as he wrapped an arm around her. They sat there in the quiet, no longer needing to fill the space with talk, the warmth between them steady as a lamp that had been lit for a long time and showed no sign of going out. Outside, Ibadan's night went on as it always did, but inside, the home belonged to its heartbeat again. My advice to you, dear listener, is this. In every home, peace is not built by noise or stubbornness, but by knowing your worth and standing firm in it without losing kindness. Never let anyone push you out of your rightful place, but also never let bitterness grow where patience can stand. Wisdom is knowing when to be silent, when to act, and when to let the river find its course. May your home be filled with laughter that warms the walls, understanding that silences quarrels before they start, and love that overflows into every corner. May no hand or heart rise to scatter what you have built, and may every plan to trouble your peace fall before it reaches your door. May you walk in strength without pride, and in humility without fear. May your table never lack food, your heart never lack joy, and your roof never lack harmony. In your going out and coming in, may favor surround you like the morning sun, and may your steps be ordered toward peace all your days. If you believe it, say aloud amen. Hope you enjoyed this interesting story. Please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Turn on post notifications. See you on our next story.